she was supposed to come up there, and her mom found out that I was there and said, "You're not going to Berkeley," so I came down to Los Angeles, and we got married, and we were working while we were married, and then graduated from UCLA, went to graduate school at Indiana University, went to Russia for a year on a postdoc, so my degree is in mathematical experimental psychology and Soviet area studies. Met a remarkable guy there, and got essentially the germ of the idea of cultural historical, cultural mediational psychology, because that was where I was coming from, sort of picked up that germ there, and I don't know, there's a research program, so I had a research program that was focused around the role of culture in human development. A lot of it occurred in West Africa in the context of sort of post-colonial pushes on education, modern education, and in Liberia, which was America's colony, so to speak, in West Africa. And the cross-cultural work and the Russian work started to come together intellectually and substantively, because it turned out that this guy I'd gone to work with, although I didn't know it at the time, had done cross-cultural work in Central Asia in the 1930s, and we resuscitated that and started to replicate it. So there was this interesting sort of research intellectual connection around that. And so that was where, I mean, I subsequently, sort of in work life, I came back from the Soviet Union, couldn't get a job from there in 1962, 63. No, you weren't going to get a job here. Couldn't get the mail from here to there. So I went and I had a postdoc at Stanford where my advisor had moved from Indiana. And they didn't really, I started to write up my thesis because I got my degree I got my degree in less than 3 years. So it was like, and out, right? My advisor was moving, and it was a form of science that you could kind of do on a boilerplate and get on and do it, and I did that. So I spent a postdoc year figuring out what the hell I'd been doing in my thesis anyway, and writing that up, and sort of because I had an active passport, which is rare for young people at that time. And because I had a degree in mathematical psychology, I was sent by a consortium doing the new mathematics to West Africa to find out, why are these people having so much trouble learning arithmetic? That was the problem. So I was trying to improve education in West Africa, was the umbrella concern, connected with the late 1960s reform movement here in the United States toward activity-based science curricula, an early version of the science and STEM and STEAM and all that kind of stuff that you hear today. So from Stanford, I got my first job at Yale. I'd started to work in West Africa, and at Yale, there are very limited abilities to talk with other faculty interested in such a wild thing as doing this work. Why would anybody do that? And I find Yale an offensive place. I said I was born in the West Coast, and in the West Coast, I'm properly dressed on the West Coast. At Yale, you had to be wearing a tie, and there is an Eastern establishment, and it does do its thing, and it has to do with class in a way that I didn't feel in Los Angeles. So there's a kind of cultural difference. I didn't like Yale at all. And went from there to Irvine. And Irvine in the 1960s was an extraordinarily unusual place, and the School of Social Sciences was extraordinarily unusual because it was completely interdisciplinary within the social sciences. And the only rule that we adopted, because it was done democratically by the organizational theorist James March, who's a very influential 20th, 21st century sociologist, political scientist, and he just let the faculty self-organize. And so we got 1/10 of the budget. Each faculty member, regardless of rank, was given 1/10 of the total budget, and they could either use it themselves, all by their lonesome, or they could come together in congregations that they thought would be useful. The only rule being that the unit that you identified could not be mappable onto an existing social science discipline. That was the rule. And then we'd get together every Saturday for like 4 hours and talk about it. And they had people there in anthropology, linguistics, psychology, political science, and so on. So it was a very fertile environment for cross-disciplinary work on culture and development. And culture and development has been my own underlying sort of way of going about things for and Irvine, however, was that experiment in multidisciplinarity didn't hold, and it split up. There are always personalities involved, but the personalities it's not interesting when you get into the personalities. But March left and went to Stanford. There was a sort of crisis of leadership, and at that same time, I was invited to a job at Rockefeller University in New York by my former thesis advisor, along with a couple of other people who were in the Academy of Sciences. Just like, wow, totally amazing. And so I went, and they ended up giving me a job there. And for 9 years, I was in New York. So a lot of the work then, that's from 1969 on, was run out of New York. And that's when I did a lot of the cross-cultural work, the work in West Africa, work in the Yucatan, and during which there was the publication of Vygotsky's work, which I was involved with, and the sort of coming together of the cross-cultural stuff, and then the opportunity opened up here in communication. And I came here partly because I'm from Los Angeles, and an apartment in New York is very nice across the street from work, but then your kids commute to school to wherever, and a different kind of life. And that I found Third College very attractive. And Third College was meant to be a multiracial college. Issues of ethnicity were a big issue in my laboratory, and in beginning to form the laboratory, I thought that UCSD would be a much healthier place to try to do that kind of work. There were senior faculty of color here who were welcoming to me being here. We had a training grant so that we could train minority group people to engage in this work, where otherwise it was colonialists coming into their neighborhoods doing it for sure, and just was no way. You couldn't do that work. And I couldn't do it. I didn't want to do it, and they didn't want anybody doing it. So it was, but then what do? Well, you've got to give them the training and let them do whatever they're going to do. And in that sense, that's continued in the laboratory, and that continued through the communication department, because look at it. I mean, there you got it. So, like that's background stuff. For me, cultural mediation is the central process that you want to engage in. So in terms of the origins of the documents that you have on the origins of the department, I really focused on a triangle, right? A mediational triangle. I thought, first of all, I could hold down one part of it. There are human beings involved, and there's always a theory about psychology. Even if you aren't a psychologist, there's some kind of theory there. Herb had a theory. He was always accused of his implicit theory being sort of cultural dope. That just you take in the propaganda, and that he didn't give enough in his writings. It seemed like over-deterministic, the cultural imperialist notions. And in his teaching, however, he always challenged students to think for themselves, to get out and be active. But his overall top-down kind of, there's a political economy here sitting on your shoulders was a hard message for the students. At the same time, he made it very, well, you saw what kind of an incredibly articulate guy, well-informed guy he was. And very, very controversial on the campus. So that kind of sets the background of how I got to be here. And the laboratory was moved from New York, and has been a part of different research organizations here. What was initially an overlap of psychology, the Center for Human Information Processing, That's why originally we were called CHIP here, human culture and communication and human information processing, because it was the same as CHIP over there, and it was interpreted as scientific, which at the time was a very useful thing for people to think about happening in the communication department, because it wasn't really doing, it was doing a kind of humanities, social science, critical writing stuff that you see. Anyway, that's how I got here. And then we had to revise the curriculum. The curriculum revision was done. Herb was away. In room 201 down there, I meet with all the I created a course for all students who were interested. The course was called Revise the Curriculum within 10 weeks. And we sent to all the existing programs anything that was relevant to communication around the country, and brought them in and looked at them and looked at our resources. And we came to an agreement about what the curriculum would be about, this sort of three-sided thing, plus practice. Plus, you guys have 280 as a result of that, because we think you got to produce something and learn how wrong you are in what you think, how short you fall of your goals when you try to do that, and then be able to criticize your own practice. So maybe stop, and that's kind of gets us up to the beginning. I don't know where you want to go.
LCHC didn't start here; it started at Rockefeller, right?
Yeah.
Could you talk about the labs, say what the acronym means, and then tell us?
Why is that?
You mentioned the opportunity opened here.
Yeah.
What was it about seizing that opportunity that was valuable to you? Could you have taken this lab anywhere, or was there something happening here that made it?
Oh, well, in fact, when I got here, internal rough and tumble began, and the communication building that you now there, those were the facilities, and teacher education had a little bit of room there, and the lab was there, and I brought a bunch of money with me when I came, right? And they knew they wanted money, and they wanted some big time academic, right, to give respectability if they were going to whatever this thing was about, bring some stability and respectability, and money. People always like to have money, and doesn't matter who the people are, because they'll, wherever they are at the moment. But basically, I was told that it was, unfortunately, my office would remain over here on this campus. They were going to put the lab over in the basement in Revelle. And I said, well, maybe this was all a mistake, and I got myself a really fancy job offer somewhere else. And then I brought it back to them, and I said, now, can we reconsider how we go about doing this? And so the way things started over there were 2.5 faculty members. There were 330 majors, right? And lots of cross-listed courses and stuff like that. As I started to pull back, with that ratio is not legal. That's against the rules. So I would go to the academic senate committees and say, how about giving back these positions? Now, the positions in part weren't there because it was a very highly politicized department, and there were people in the department who would mouth sort of normal academics who walked in, who might be nice liberals, but they weren't about to sign on to the Lumumba Zapata version of 1970s politics. They just weren't going to do that, and they got pushed out, and their departments took them back. And the popularity of communication was great. And at that time, they were afraid of losing students. It was one of those periods where UC was afraid of losing students. And they were afraid that if we closed the communication program, that they'd lose the students, they'd go elsewhere. And so the imbalance allowed us to start to hire back faculty. So Dan Hallen was hired back on a position from political science, for example. And people started to come to us and we said, let's try and make it work. I was very conservative. I was actually interested in a communication program. I was not interested in a communication department because I knew what communication departments were like. And I didn't want to be in psychology here, but I didn't want to be in that kind of communication department. So I liked the idea of program. But as we started to hire people, as it started to work, we hired Helene Kesar as a deal that was great for us. She was a wonderful person to have here. We hired Michael Schutz. Nobody thought, and sociology was totally delighted. Because the myth had been we couldn't hire anybody. But once we showed we could hire somebody, the deal was if you were a program, you only got half of that person's time. We were at 330 to 2.5. So every time we hired a whole person, you only got a half a person. Right? And if it's a junior person, that junior person would be put under a lot of, not ideal thing for a junior person to do. So that started the pressure to become a department. Right? Because you weren't going to be able in a finite period of time at a half of a person, even if you did it every year, and how could you be coherent and what would it be about? So that was the push for a department. And I mean, that's the way it went.
So having to hire in people half with communication and half with another department, that had to contribute to what we're talking about in an interdisciplinary conversation. If these people have to be hired in through the other departments.
I've always thought, here's the question. Is it an interdisciplinary department, whatever an interdisciplinary department means, right? Is it an interdisciplinary department? Or is it about the discipline? Is it to be a discipline? And I think that that was where, I mean, that contradiction is there from the very beginning. So in order to become a department, we had to argue that we were a respectable discipline. Now, I personally did not believe we were a respectable discipline. But you had to have a story about how you were a respectable discipline, how your students would get jobs, how you would make UCSD famous, and all the rest. And you couldn't just have an undergraduate program. And up until then, communication had only been an undergraduate program. So you had to say, you're going to have a graduate program. So the documents and the ideas there, you can recognize as a pure Vygotskian triangle at one level. Now take it and this is the way I try to talk about it. I say, put Sergei Eisenstein up in the culture part, but it's the mediational part, right? Put somebody like George Lukács, a good political economist theorist of this sort, over in the social force, what became the social force part, and put Vygotsky over in the other part of the triangle. And that was more or less, and I came in teaching about literacy, and nobody cared about literacy. The students really did not care about it. They all wanted to point cameras. And that was the knock on the department, or one of the knocks on the department. And so, I got to, what was good for me, I got to teach how to read a film. And we'd always I'd teach with somebody who really knew about it, and then I'd learn about it. And there's nothing more fun than teaching film, period. You can get paid to teach film the rest of your life. I just do it. It just evolved. So, I guess I've gotten lost in the question here.
Well, you said just a minute ago you didn't believe that this was a respectable discipline.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Well, what did you have? I mean, in 1984, there was a famous issue of 884, after we became a department. There was a famous issue of the Journal of Communication called Ferment in the Field.
Yeah. 4
years later. And ask the question again, Thomas. I had to get back.
You mentioned that you didn't believe this was a, quote, respectable discipline.
Well, if you looked around, when you pulled the whole thing, it was completely eclectic. You had the people who were doing developmental economics. The closest you came to people who were actually serious I thought, were in Pennsylvania, where you had Irving Goffman, and you had Ray Birdwhistle, and you had George Gerber, and and believe it or not, they had a triangle as They sort of got it, they got it. Montreal, there was a sort of French semiotic version of something that we could think about. And for myself, coming from a Vygotsky perspective, it was all about interdisciplinarity. I mean, here's a guy who is essentially developing a Marxist theory where psychology is going to be a piece of this more general theory of human change. And that fit right in with my interest in human development. Right. So I still think communication is I'm very lucky to be able to address things and teach a course called Mediational Theories of Mind and not have it be weird. Just plain weird. But that idea, I don't think it ever was, well, in the beginning, the faculty together taught this introduction. Everybody kind of knew about each other's work really pretty well, and and different people would teach the class so they'd all hear about each other. And then over time, the institutional, people left for reasons like the two-body problem. They couldn't possibly resolve the two-body problem. Or somebody couldn't get their work done that we really liked. Or somebody was married to somebody who couldn't get a green card and had a business someplace, a different version of the two-body problem, or whatever those kind of institutional things were. And so people left and other people came in. And I think over time, then, that sort of initial impetus, that there was one point at which this could have been the leading sort of Vygotskian, whatever that sociocultural place in the world. Because in the history of this department, I came here and I was well known in doing that. James Wirch came here, he was a major figure in doing that. David Bockhurst came here, he was a major figure in doing that. Phil Agre, who then linked it into artificial intelligence, came here, and everybody was here. Just barely overlapping, sort of coming and going like that. But that sort of passed, and then I don't think any other combined vision of anything took its place. So I always thought that if a discipline were to grow, I still believe this, I guess. If a discipline were to grow, it would grow for this department out of the introductory course. The introductory course should be the basic core, and that's the way. I mean, I had to argue. It was very hard. We had a 3-part curriculum for the undergraduates. That was easy. When I came in, it was macro, micro, and media. So I turned it around and went into the individual, the social world, and the media, and the cultural mediation in between. That semiotic, general semiotic. And then really the issue was, how much variability were you going to allow in that? How many people were actually interested in trying to continually work on that introduction and figure out what the meta theory is that sort of combines things? And I don't think it just hasn't happened. And people have now come in with varying kinds of interests and stuff, and they know each other's work differentially. Some know it very well, some really don't know it very well. And they're operating in an extremely difficult institutional environment. It's not at all what it was before. And so that's what you see the faculty struggling with there. The laboratories has continued, and now it was for many years. What I really appreciate is if you guys took a look at the wiki, and you need to read the document in which has the underlying rationale of how it is that the Vygotskian meta-perspective and a Dewey-esque American pragmatist meta-perspective form a really interesting combination of ideas around which you could create a discipline of communication, maybe. Which doesn't exclude anybody here. I mean, I love all the stuff on performance. I have my own interpretation of people's relevance here. But it's good now that people, for example, I love going to the faculty lectures. We didn't have that before. They're always very interesting how the faculty react to those kinds.
Well, you mentioned that you've encountered students who arrive and as you said, kind of don't know what to expect here, and are surprised by the, I guess, sort of the interdisciplinariness of the department. how would you advise those students? What would you say to them to prepare them for this experience?
Well, first of all, I think there's still work on the faculty's part in order to make relatively coherent the different perspectives, if they're going to sort of claim 3 different perspectives and just rename them. And there are good reasons for doing that institutionally. At the undergraduate level, it allows you, in terms of economy of organization of the curriculum, to start with great big introductory class, break it up into 3 classes because it's a 3-quarter system, so you can map your intellectual structure onto the institutional structure. That's part of what I'm always insisting on triangles, not just because that's the magic cross against reductionism, right? You can't have less than 3. So it's a trinary, a triple helix, sort of. You get me off into these individual things now. My age shows.
But yeah, what would you tell students who
well,
have
I
seen
think
computers?
Chandra really had the best advice, right? And when she was chair, it was a little easier for students because the parts of the curriculum were a little bit more. People had been together longer, who were there, and were a little bit more together as things, and a little bit more repeated. Although there had to be conflict in that structure. There's no way not to. But Chandra would say, look, most of you come in kind of knowing about 2/3 of this stuff. You've had exposure. Maybe it's in the humanities and social sciences, or maybe it's in the humanities and arts part, or maybe it's in the arts and a little bit of some of it. The 3rd part, everybody doesn't know crap about the 3rd part, and probably about them. Some people know a lot about production, not about other stuff. So that, I think she would always say that at the introduction to the first-year students. I always thought that was a very smart thing to say. So the fact that you're completely clueless about at least 1/3 of the time, never mind that people are pushing heavy theorists on you in the areas that you haven't yet learned about. That makes it, that's why the first-year courses are such a big deal. And I think like they didn't start with this year's class by having faculty come in on the first. See, I just think that's just a terrible mistake because. So.
296.
My advice always is to first-year students, take a new 299 with some person along with your basic classes, so you have extra time to read this other stuff that you're supposed to read. Because there's some people around here who think that if the stack of books isn't this high, it's not a class. And I just I look at that and say you need a lot of time, unless you've already read it once. If you're just reading it for the first time, oh my God. That's what. But with 2nd-year students, I'd say you should be talking to somebody. You should have an advisor by now. You shouldn't go into the 2nd year of this program without an advisor. Really, because you're going to need to, and they're pushing you. They're trying to push you through faster, which is good. I said I did it in less than 3 years, which is insane. But 3 or 4 years is it's more than that. You got to get out there, and where there's work, and then to help to figure out the connections to where the work is, and still remain critical, and still remain deviant and weird. So that's always been the tension. Remember, I said I didn't think it was worth the powder to blow it up. On the one hand, the alternative to that is just come in and everybody do what they feel like doing and call it communication, right? Because something you do has something to do with the media. But you really don't care about communication. It's just, okay, and you're free to do it, and there's lots of interesting people around. And I think that's another way to organize intellectual life. And the one buzz you have to worry about it is the quality of undergraduate education you give, and to be responsible for mentoring the graduate students. So that the graduate students are not here without somebody to talk to who is not a mere formality.
How do you keep it from becoming that? How do you keep interdisciplinary studies from becoming just what you described, everybody kind of doing what they want as long as it dips its toe in media? And how has this department accomplished that?
Well, it didn't. I don't think it has. I mean, insofar as, for a while we had, it has certain common characteristics. one of them that's really interesting is that I think, without exception, maybe in a couple of young, but I don't think there are any exceptions to this, everybody takes history very seriously. What? A communication department that takes history very seriously? Now, we don't still take it so seriously in the introductory class. We used to take it seriously where I would teach about the origins of money and literacy in the 10th century BC, right? And it started at the beginning. But Chandra is a historical sociologist. Olga and I do longitudinal histories of childhood and institutions and stuff. So everybody kind of has that historical focus. Another is that everybody thinks that culture is important. So culture is in a way the fulcrum of the department. And then we have this business of individual and society, which is an analytic trap, right? Because individual, the meaning of the word individual is a member of society. So to set up the society versus the individual, there's no such thing as a single individual, period. And it probably does take a village. It certainly takes 3. And there's incest involved. If you get down to 3, there's incest involved. And it better be the right 3. I don't know. I think what you guys organize your faculty, and I think Val is doing such a fantastic job at this court. I mean, it's just like been so stimulating, and there's a lot of work for the faculty to do because they're facing these, lots of pressures, drops in enrollment, switches in student stuff. So they have a lot of hard problems to deal with.
So
Glad I don't.
why does the idea of interdisciplinary studies sometimes cause such controversy? I was reading in the 80s.
Because at its extreme, so there are 2 extremes you want to get away from. Right. I'm always doing life in the middle. So the one extreme is the extreme where you create this sort of iron paradigm and everybody has to do research in kind of the same way. And I think with my notion of maybe you could have a discipline, what would it mean to have a discipline? What does discipline mean? That you don't want to be controlled by, everybody has to do something original, academia, all of that kind of stuff. And people don't get rewarded for the collaborative work that they do. And when they do that kind of stuff, it's often is hidden labor for people. So there's an incentive thing. But then there's also the problem of evaluation gets to be really hard. Because somebody can always say within the department, I'll just give an extreme. Let's say somebody was doing quantitative, it doesn't happen to be true, but somebody was doing, well, Dan Hallen's kind of work, where more or less you get categories of things and you count them up and you compare one place with another in terms of a content analysis of this, that, or the other thing. And you put that up against, and you want to look at that, if the person's going to go up for promotion or get a plus in the bureaucracy of some sort. Mm-hmm. And now you heard Patrick talk about this new book that he's writing. Now, tell me, how would you evaluate one in terms of the other? Who would evaluate one in terms of the other? What are the common set of evaluative principles? Or do you just have to turn it over to somebody in the more narrow field? So with Patrick, do you go to somebody into performance studies and get your letters from there? And everybody recognizes you're dealing with a really smart and committed person. There's no question about that. But then think about the issue of trying to do that. And that problem, to a greater or lesser extent, exists within the department. At the same time that the department has to come together around that and represent people to the outside. So you can't, I don't know of any, I cannot remember a case where this department has not tried to support its junior people as best as it possibly could. But there have been cases where the junior people were not supportable. You just couldn't, because you could take that argument, whatever the best argument you could put together was, and even if you had a sympathetic committee of your peers on the outside, you couldn't make it stand. And so people have had to leave. But that's not what the department wants. It's just like with the graduate program. You put a lot of time into building something, and when people leave in the middle of it, it's very disruptive. And with you guys, you're creating a next generation of something while you're inventing the thing that you're trying to create. So sort of you guys are creating the discipline, in my view, it's the graduates, in a way, who now are starting to move into positions in large organizations. Mary Gray with her important work that she does at Microsoft and so on. So you see the sort of influence of that. And it's, we have an awfully good faculty. They're awfully smart people. Right.
The 1984 report that I read, this
Yeah.
status report, the opening line of it is, since its inception over a decade ago, the program in communications at UCSD has generated more controversy in the committees of the Senate than any other single issue. Is that the same kind of controversy we're talking about, or was that a whole other kettle of fish?
I have another, I went off on a wrong branch. I wrote another report in 1984 about the lab. So this is, which document are you talking about here?
I got this off the,
off the web.
LCHC
right,
site.
Right. It's one of our
this was a
official
status
documents.
report where it was basically saying, hey, we've got 500 majors, we have like, what, 5 or 6 faculty.
In 1984, that document?
I think that's what it said.
I'll bet you it's earlier.
And you were
Well,
pleading,
it's
it was a plea for more faculty.
Okay, yeah. Well, yeah, because there was, you cannot imagine the degree of hostility, literally, you cannot imagine the degree of hostility. It's like one of those bad English novels about academia and hostilities, right? The hostility against the communication department was extreme. There are people in the department, and especially some of the students, who were also pretty extreme off the other side. So there were people, even after we became a department, who really thought that we were a hotbed of radicals trying to tear down the institution. It certainly wasn't true. And there were internal tensions because some people were more politically engaged and more on the left than others. But from the outside, there was a time, this is a true story, okay? And the people doesn't matter, people aren't around. But there was a time when they wanted to maybe move communication in to the big social science building down there where all the other social sciences are. And the chair of one of the other social sciences departments said, if you move communication into that building, we refuse to move. Honest. And you go, what? You gotta be joking. No, they weren't joking.
What was the objection?
What?
What was the
They
objection?
didn't, the politicalness of it. And it was still Herb, pretty much. And, you know, I'm the sort of social equality guy. So, and I'm the guy that lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis sitting in Moscow next to the Kremlin, so, and lived through Soviet life. And I come from a radical background, which you didn't ask me about before. So, in Herb, I didn't have any difficulty getting along with Herb at all. And letting the radical stuff, because there's a lot of radical stuff that needed to be said in the department. And this place was, all the minority group people associated with the lab who helped to people up the lab for the first couple of years, they were all forced out. When they came up for stuff that might be tenure, none of them were deemed good enough. One of them is a member of the National Academy of Education. You know, so it was, and Olga was in fact the first person that we were able to bring in who stuck. And otherwise, the vast majority of the minority group postdocs and graduate students who came through social sciences came through the laboratory for a number of years, for a long time.
You mentioned earlier too that the committee, when you were trying to get the department settled,
Yeah.
didn't have a lot of sympathy for social activism.
No.
Can you talk about the roots of social activism within this particular department? And you mentioned your own radical past.
Well, no, I think the thing that, I mean, what you guys want to pull together there is some of the stuff from the early 70s when there were, I mean, this was, remember that Herbert Marcuse was on this campus and Angela Davis was on this campus, and they were part of Third College. So when I came in, they called it Lumumba Zapata College, right? But that was an unofficial name. And there was, in fact, it was in the cement outside here, which has probably been erased since then. Okay, and then Thurgood Marshall, so you can imagine the shift in the politics. If you go from Lumumba Zapata to Thurgood Marshall. That's a perfect indication of what the nature of the political shift was. Right there. And I was really, because of my comparative research and my training program and wanting to have people of color who were my colleagues, I'm only getting to that in the current generation with people like Angela Booker. It's just taken a long time. Long, long time.
And how has the nature of this department supported that kind of activity?
Because they totally agree with me. On that subject, there's just no question. There's simply no question. So if you want a department that's really seriously interested in diversity, you came to the right place. Right. So in that sense, I think we're total leaders on campus, and I think lead by example. There I feel it's a very interesting political time with respect to issues of class and ethnicity. It really is. And I think we're seeing something I've never seen in my lifetime, which is a shift. So that sort of gay rights are kind of, relatively speaking, there. And we're getting some people of color, and it's easy to hire women, relatively speaking, to when I started, because it was completely male. White male was really not a bad description of it. So diversity has really increased, and I think our department now, it's always impressed me that of all the kinds of diversity that they haven't seriously looked at, it's social class. And now social class is coming back in big time in the popular imagination, in the popular political discourse. Seems like social class and communication is going to have to be something that people take up, coming up in the future. And that in the lab, if you're listening to the stuff in the lab, that's what we're talking. We're talking about issues of trying to put social class back in there and trying to figure that. Now, how do you deal with that? Beats me. Beats me. It's a tough problem.
What haven't we talked about that you think we should cover?
One thing I think that is probably worth knowing about the department is it was for a long time very suspicious of new media. I had a really difficult time getting people to pay attention to the internet. It took years and years. And I think that's changing with the generational change in the faculty who are coming in. So they, just like you're being urged to be multimodal, you're now beginning to get the first multimodal kinds of professoriate coming in, which I think is a good thing. But people are worried about technological determinism. So there's a kind of suspicion of technology that when I started, it was like television is bad for you and the internet's a waste of time. I myself thought that cell phones were a waste of time. I don't like telephones altogether. They interrupt me. I don't like being interrupted when I'm talking to somebody. But if my phone rang right now, I'd probably say, excuse me, and answer the phone, which I think is done. My sense of sociality says that's probably not a good thing to do, but I'm just old-fashioned.
What do you think the roots of that resistance to new media were? Because I've noticed even in the year and a half I've been here.
Well, that's interesting. It's partly generational. It's partly that everybody has seen. There's a really good introduction to communication we don't read here called Misunderstanding Media by a guy named Brian Winston, who I think he was a dean for a while at Pennsylvania State or something like that. Very, very smart guy. And he has this sort of laws of communication, which I think would be worth discussing, where when a new medium comes in, people try to use it to do better something they're already doing, but it has these affordances that people didn't actually notice were going to be important, and that it's the side consequences of the new media that get to be really important. And the technological determinism is really looking at the main effects. And I think people were suspicious of that. I think there's another reason to be suspicious, which is that by my own analysis of teaching over years and years and doing the sort of deep history of communication, that there's this kind of historical trade-off between the power of the media in terms of its reach and the ability for control, for centralized control. And I always teach 1984 as the first thing I have students read, because I treat it as communications null hypothesis, total control. So the students come in and they think that newspeak is a possible language, and they think that the idea that he who controls the present controls the past, and say they who control the past control the future. And they think that's bullshit. And I organize a class to try to get them to reverse their point of view, and to think that insofar as total control of the present is possible, you can get, of the past is possible, you can get control of the present. So total control would be, and I think 1984 is a working out of that. I think Orwell knew that it was impossible. So, and I think it's a really interesting place to start. But there's total, and then you have the instrumental model of communication, and a number of radicals used it. So you put the power of the mass media in the hands of the corporations. If you have total control of the media by the corporations, then the media can control by creating false consciousness of the proletariat. So you'd be suspicious of that mediating mechanism insofar as it was said to be deterministic of something, and you'd want to resist that. So I think that's probably an underlying true suspicion, because I mean my view of them, when the internet started, oh my God, people thought it was the greatest thing for democracy you ever heard. It was, and we ourselves, you can read stuff, and we were critical skeptics, but we could see for people who were isolated in a variety of kinds of ways, this was useful. And that the power of computers as simulative environments can create really great educational joint activity. And if you're worried about inequality in this country, then you sort of end up with education as one of the things you worry about. Because they do it real good to kids by the time they're in 4th grade. They've probably gotten pretty well arranged, the way things work. So, yeah, I think you got time. We've talked for a long time.
Yeah.
We have a lot of cutting to do for this.
I know you said you need
Anything
to
else
be
to
gone.
comment?
No, I'm actually okay until 12.
Well, I really want to actually
Yeah.
get you, because you mentioned your radical origins.
Yeah.
Tell us more about those.
Well,
we've heard
if you look around, let's see, I think probably we don't have all of the pictures here. If you go take a look at that picture over there, because I have a bunch of stuff in my other office, but and the picture back over there, Carolyn, if you get that picture that's hanging on the wall over there, up high, it's a crowd of people, and
Yeah.
Nalini, this one over here, this crazy looking thing.
This one right here?
Yeah. What do you make of that? What do you recognize there? What does a group make of a picture like that?
Show you the front. You put it down.
We put it down here?
Yeah.
Can you see it in the shot?
No, you're not gonna be able to
Well,
see
we
it.
can do close-up later.
Yeah, you can do stuff later, but what do you see? What do you see? What does it say? First of all, what's the picture? Does anybody have a film background? You'd recognize the picture right away. That's a sketch by Sergei Eisenstein.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Now, and so here it says in Russian, I can't, but it's something with something else. And this says a drawing of S.M. Eisenstein. And this says to Comrade Lester Cole, what does it say there? A memory of a wonderful evening in Moscow in January 1963. And that's signed by Luria. And he's the guy that I went to work with. And this is a picture from, I think it was 1949, of a huge peace rally in Paris. And there's a set of these drawings. I got this from my aunt. She lived in Paris at the time. So the historical thread that way then runs through having and my father wrote was you can get, there's a book out that I have a copy somewhere. There's a book called Hollywood Red. And he went to jail for a year. So there's a picture of him, there's one of those jail pictures. And he was one of the architects, he was one of the guys who wrote the Constitution for the Screenwriters Guild. And don't get me emotional thinking about history now. So growing up, I grew up in a family that was very politically involved. And if you look down in room 250, we haven't really, Val wants to, you know, do these rooms around that have been named for people artistically, but there's a picture of my mom there. And it's a poster from 1950, and she ran for Congress. And in 1950-51, my dad went to jail for contempt of Congress. And so that was the beginning of the sort of McCarthy era. 1947 was the House Un-American Activities Committee. So I grew up in an activist background. My radicalism wasn't of the same kind as his. And so what I got out of it as a young person growing up was probably a combination of anti-racism and belief in the First Amendment. And they call these people premature anti-fascists. And that's what they were. My father but he was a true believer. And there was an expression in Moscow when my wife and I went there. And I did not go to Indiana University planning to go to Moscow. That was all fortuitous. But you can see the lineup of the interesting history that would make you make those choices. So going to Russia was not anything I ever planned to do. Never had it in my mind. But going into Indiana put me where the exchange program was, and put it where the exchange program was, it turned out I had to have a minor outside of psychology. And I wasn't good at math. So even though I was a mathematical psychologist, so I did Russian area studies. I also had to learn another language. You had to have 2 foreign languages. So they paid me, I got a 10% raise in my fellowship in order to study Russian, which I had to do anyway. So then I was eligible to go, and I went and I worked with the only guy whose work I knew, who was this guy Alexander Luria, who turned out worked with Vygotsky, who I didn't really know about at all. So all of that was kind of fortuitous. But that's the sort of the radical background. And it makes me a very ambiguous figure, right, for a lot of people, because on the one hand, it seems like I'm very radical and I deal with all these Russians and what have you. And on the other hand, I had this Stalinist father with whom I argued all of my life. So it's like, and so arguing with Herb was really easy. I mean, that was like, they were very simple. Very similar that way. So that's the sort of radical background part. And today, of course, I'm very conservative. So, I mean, relatively speaking. And it made coming here in communication really an interesting thing to do. Right? And I still do stuff with the Russians. But now the Russians, when I was there, were dissidents off of one side. Now they're dissidents off of the other side. So you just keep trying to interact around the core ideas of what can humanity do. Okay. That's it. Hi there.
Hey.
You got more stuff?
Got it.
That's a different kind of story.
That was wonderful.
Okay.
I wish I could listen to you for hours, but we know you have a schedule. It looks like other people in this room. That was amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, you're
Mark,
welcome.
thank you. I appreciate the time.
You're welcome. I do think that there's on the wiki, there's just a porthole there that says communication was a big part of all of this. And I think what's happened is the laboratory now has gotten very narrow, And Angela's involved, and Stefan involved, and there's this issue about whether it will reinvent itself in some way. That's completely up for grabs, right, at the moment. The department itself is now, you can see it reforming, right? And now there's this current issue about what's the relationship between those two going to be. And that's not my generation's thing to do, so I just, you see me when I come in here, I just participate in the discussions, because I carry a part of the history of it that people can select from what parts they want to use going forward. Yeah. Try and help out.
Sure, we appreciate
Like
it.
that. Sure.
All right, great.
I think what you're doing is great. I think it'll help the faculty a lot, right? For you to think about it and try to figure out how do we give good undergraduate education here and still do good scholarship. How do we do that? It's a really hard problem.
Oh,
Anyway,
yeah.
yeah.
And going off of that, same thing as graduate students, those of us who might be interested in some type of practice as well, how do we remain engaged in communities while at the same time trying to engage in really good scholarship as well? What's that balance like?
Well, but Carolyn, you've seen the people here who've been able to do that, and I only know about it in this domain of it, this sort of domain around enculturation and the mania with making, improving, making progress in education and that kind of stuff. And there, I don't think it's a really big deal, because you can do really good critical ethnography, you can really do good community development work, you can really get your undergraduates out into these situations with diverse populations of people who they come to admire, they just had no connection with. So in that area, that's kind of what the laboratory has been around community-grounded research. I don't think that there's any contradiction there at all, and I think there is a marketplace for that. There's more than one. And if you look at like the work of Lisa Tripp coming out of here, to meet people who combine interest in media with this kind of stuff. There's a lot to be done around the reorganization of activity and new media. That's just wide open. Rachel Cody's thesis, I think, is going to be really exciting in that. So it's harder for me to figure out when you're dealing with these deep historical things, like Chandra doing the canal de Midi. I mean, that's a whole other world in and of itself. So then not everybody wants to do that. There's a lot to be said for, well, I mean, I don't think there's anything to be said for completely divorcing theory from practice. Anything at all to be said for it. But there are various ways in which you can do it. And different people on the faculty deal with it in different ways. I've combined it a lot. But this university is not well set up for combining research and education. It's outside the charter of organized research units to do education. You're going, what? So then you create these hybrid organizations that allow you to do what you think needs to be done. And then you try and make them stick. And that's the challenge. If you get a good thing, how do you hold on to it?
Yeah.
So, the first years ought to know, that this lab this space is open. You guys really missed this interesting, Nalini was here.
Oh,
I thought that Tuesday's lab meeting was outstanding. It was like an education in and of itself.
Good.
And everybody could have been here. And I think everybody has, what?
What made it good?
That somebody comes in who's really at the beginning of trying to think about something and going about it, and what 3 or 4 people in a room know to be a wrong way to go about doing it. It's not going to work, and there's a time deadline. And then collectively problem solving to understand what the issues are and then figure out a practical solution to it. And then it opened up into discussion about, it was a graduate student, opened up in discussion about not being a second year without an advisor. And right at this juncture, it was just like, no, don't do that. Right? So it was interesting, and it was supposed to be a workshop. We do workshops. That was one of our workshop sessions. So it actually worked like a workshop. It was like, whoa, that's amazing. I mean, from my point of view, this space is being just completely overlooked in terms of what it could be from a departmental point of view. Because you could put cameras in the corner of this and put a microphone in here, so if a good event happened and you wanted to show people how a workshop works, you can say, you want to see how a workshop works? Look at that.
Yeah.
You know. But now it's just sort of a rumor. And we'll see what comes out of it, of course.
Look at you thinking about the new media already.
Well, I've been doing that, but that's being in communication. I think I got over the cell phone stuff. The problem is, I really like old media, really, really old media, like writing. So it turns out that a number of students don't know how to use writing as a tool of thought. A number of graduate students do not know how to use writing as a tool of thought. That I take. So I think that there is some old media stuff that's very worthwhile doing. At the same time, I have no question about, especially social media in the last 5 years. I don't know what number of years it is, but it's transformed social life. And it's transforming political life. And Ruth Ginsburg says she's going to come out against Citizens Against United, and that's only 1 out of 9. So, got to get rid of Citizens United.
Amen.
Very bad idea. Okay, that's it, guys.
All right.